Hi, I'm Kathy G, and this is History. Today's topic is death by pandemic. But before we get to that, if you're a fan of the dance macabre, then please lean into the like button as if you're going to kiss it and then suddenly headbutt it. After that, laugh maniacally and subscribe to my channel. And be sure to hit the notification bell so you'll be notified each time I upload a new video, which I'm trying to do at least once a week or more. Now let's get to today's topic. We're all too familiar these days with pandemic protocols, including masking up, even the smallest among us, and practicing social distancing. Just be glad you didn't have to wear this mask. It was worn by plague doctors. I don't know, maybe I would have preferred this mask. Anywho, this isn't our first pandemic rodeo. In fact, there have been several pandemics throughout human history that have significantly affected human events, and that's what we're going to look at today. In reality, although there have always been communicable diseases, we didn't really have large-scale epidemics or pandemics until after around 10,000 years ago or so. Prior to that, our populations were hunter-gatherers, and they were small, only some 30 to 50 individuals. So any disease that infected them either killed everyone or immunized them before it could spread to another group. But about 10,000 years ago, we adopted agriculture as a subsistence strategy. It was a great one, too, because it allowed us to stay in one place rather than having to move around. It also gave us more control over our food production, and we were able to start producing enough food so that we could store it for times when food wasn't as plentiful. That helped us survive, but it also made us a little greedy. I guess there's a price to pay for everything. Anyway, after we adopted agriculture and started living in communities with denser and larger populations, that's when we really began to see more epidemics. Among the first were malaria, tuberculosis, leprosy, influenza, and smallpox. Once we started moving around the globe, we began taking our diseases with us and sharing them with everyone we met. We're real nice that way. Of course, not everyone liked that, and so there were some conflicts. And often those same diseases we were spreading around changed the outcome of the wars we waged. Let's look at several pandemics that changed history. One of the first recorded pandemics happened at the time of the Peloponnesian War. That was an ancient Greek war fought between the forces of Athens and Sparta between 431 and 404 BCE. That's the new BC. That's why this pandemic is called the Athens pandemic. During that war, there was an outbreak of a disease that caused fever, thirst, a bloody throat and tongue, and a red skin with a rash. Now you have to understand that diseases back then were often called something different if doctors had a name for them at all. So we have to try to diagnose the disease based on the recorded symptoms. These symptoms suggest the disease could have been typhoid fever. It's caused by the salmonella bacteria. Remember salmonella from the 1970s? You're probably too young. Here's another view of the specific salmonella strain that causes typhoid fever. Typhoid fever causes rose spots on your chest and a fever as high as 103 to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 39 to 40 degrees Celsius. It also causes weakness, stomach pains, headache, and loss of appetite. That's a bad set of symptoms if you're fighting a war. This particular outbreak of typhoid fever that affected the Peloponnesian War first spread through Libya, Ethiopia, and Egypt before crossing into Athens. And it happened to do that just when the Spartans were laying siege to the city. As much as 2/3 of the Athenian population died from this disease, and it so weakened them that it is believed to have been a significant factor in their defeat by the Spartans. The next pandemic, and by the way, a pandemic is defined as occurring when a disease spreads beyond the boundaries of a single country. And the next one we're going to talk about is the Antonine Plague, which occurred in 165 CE. CE is the new AD. The Antonine Plague began with the Huns. You might be most familiar with Attila the Hun pictured here. Anyway, the Huns then infected the Germans, who passed it to the Romans, the returning soldiers of which rapidly spread the disease throughout the Roman Empire. Here's a map showing their territory in this part of the world. They did get around and they took their diseases with them, eventually inflicting the Roman Empire. hence the depiction of the angel of death knocking at the door of Roman citizens. The disease that caused this plague is believed to have been an early example of smallpox. Here you see the smallpox virions. A virion is just an entire virus particle. The symptoms of smallpox include fever, a sore throat, diarrhea, and if the person lives long enough, these horrible pus-filled sores. There is also a hemorrhagic variant that causes extensive bleeding into the skin, the mucous membranes, the gastrointestinal tract, and various organs. Only about 2% of smallpox infections are hemorrhagic, and this variant typically does not result in the pus-filled pustules. The origins of the disease are unknown, but there is evidence for it as early as the 3rd century BCE in Egyptian mummies. By the 18th century, in Europe, the disease killed an estimated 400,000 people every year, and nearly 1/3 of all blindness was the result of smallpox infection. The disease was unknown in the Americas, and as we'll see, caused huge losses of life after the voyages of discovery. It is estimated that smallpox killed approximately 300 million people in the 20th century and some 500 million in the last 100 years of its existence. It is also known to have killed 6 monarchs, including Huayna Capac, the last emperor of the Inca Empire following the voyages of discovery, and the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius during the Antonine Plague. He's seen here in marble. Because of how deadly this disease is, the world united to globally eradicate it through vaccination. That was achieved and certified after intense verification that it was indeed eradicated on December 9, 1979. That certification was then endorsed by the World Health Assembly on May 8, 1980. Up next we have the Cyprian plague, named after its first known victim, Saint Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage, who is depicted here. The plague occurred in 250 CE. Cyprian also documented the disease and wrote that the city dwellers attempted to flee to escape the infection, but they ended up spreading the disease, which passed into Ethiopia, through northern Africa, into Rome, and then to Egypt, and points northward. For 3 centuries there would be recurring outbreaks, and in 444 CE the disease arrived in Britain and affected defensive efforts against the Picts and the Scots, which caused the Brits to seek help from the Saxons, who would eventually take over control of the island. It is believed that this plague, like the Antonine Plague, was a result of smallpox, but historian William Hardy McNeill argues that the 2 plagues were caused by 2 different organisms. He notes that the devastation caused in Europe during the Cyprian plague is indicative of no previous exposure or immunity. That's why you saw such death and devastation. He asserts, therefore, that one of the diseases was caused by the measles, while the other was smallpox. Other historians argue both were the result of smallpox. Yet another historian, Kyle Harper, says the symptoms in the Cyprian plague are better matched to a hemorrhagic fever disease such as Ebola rather than smallpox. He does believe the Antonine plague was smallpox, however. That brings us to the Justinian plague, which happened in 541 CE. This plague appeared first in Egypt and then spread through Palestine and the Byzantine Empire. From there, it moved throughout the Mediterranean. This disease was the first major outbreak of the plague. You know, the Black Death. The plague is caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis and is believed to have affected the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, who then remarkably recovered from this outbreak, which killed approximately 1/5 of the people in the imperial capital. The outbreak of the plague squelched Justinian's plan to reunite the Roman Empire, however, and the apocalyptic atmosphere left in the wake of this disease is believed to have facilitated the rapid spread of Christianity. The disease itself would go on to kill approximately 50 million people, or 26% of the world's population. Yowza! The symptoms include enlarged lymph glands and necrosis of body parts, something called acral necrosis, which results from a decreased blood supply to the extremities, and that results in the black discoloration. The disease is spread by fleas, which are on animals common to many cities like rats. Interestingly, it is associated with global climate change. During the time of the Justinian plague, there was a cooling event that is believed to be associated with the eruption of Krakatoa in the South Pacific. The eruption caused an extensive atmospheric dust veil that effectively blocked the sun and resulted in crop failures, unusual weather patterns, and famines around the world. The evidence for this is supported by tree ring analyses that show very little growth in Irish oak trees in 536. Also, ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show substantial sulfate deposits around 534 CE. These are evidence of an acidic dust veil. The weather changes associated with the volcanic eruption did a number of things. As far as the plague bacteria is concerned, the cooling of the weather causes the bacteria to stay fixed in the flea longer than it otherwise would, which means all the better to infect you, my dear. That is combined with crop failures of hay in the territory of the Huns, which put them on the move in search of food for their horses. They came in contact with Roman forces, and the hunt was afoot. It also caused the movements of people out of places like Ethiopia, which some argue to be the origin of the plague. The events associated with climate change and subsequent plague outbreaks include things like the deposits of gold hoards at the end of the Scandinavian migration period. The gold was possibly offered as a sacrifice to appease the gods and get the sunlight to return. In the New World, the decline of Teotihuacan, a large Mesoamerican city, is associated with droughts that resulted in famines and civil unrest. The droughts are argued by David Keyes to be the result of the global cooling caused by the eruption. The Moche Empire in northern Peru suffered the opposite of droughts. They had too much rain as a result of an unusually strong El Nino event, and then that was followed by 30 years of droughts. There are sacrifices like these at the large ceremonial center Huaca de la Luna. Here you can see this one is missing an arm. This one had his hands tied behind his back. And this one, well, he had a leg stuck up inside of his chest. Talk about heartburn. All of them had cut marks all over their bodies, and all were male. Some researchers argue human sacrifices around this time are so associated with an attempt to get the gods to stop the rains. There's a long history of human sacrifice in the Andean region, however, and so it might not be possible to associate specific sacrifice events with climate change, but it is known that after the eruption and around this time period, there was an increase in civil unrest and the decline of the Moche Empire really began, though it would take another approximately 200 years. Whether these political events are associated with the climate changes following the eruption is unclear, but it is true that periods of cooling fix the plague bacteria in the flea longer and are, therefore, associated with an increase in outbreaks of plague. We still see outbreaks today as the disease is carried by fleas on animals like groundhogs in many areas of the United States. In case you're wondering, the flea is unaffected by the bacteria. So, there's that. That brings us to the 11th century outbreak of leprosy. You're looking at the bacteria that causes leprosy here. It was discovered by a man named Hansen, and so it's also referred to as Hansen's disease. Now, leprosy had been around for a long time, but it got to pandemic status in Europe in the Middle Ages. That caused the constructions of numerous leprosy hospitals called leprosaria. Despite how scary leprosy is, it's actually not very contagious, but it does cause some horrific lesions. The deformities and sores it causes caused many people to believe it was a punishment from God. That's some mean God. Anyway, that led to moral judgments against those who were infected, which led to ostracization. They often stuck a leper with a bell so that you'd know to beware. Leprosy is actually now very easily treatable with antibiotics. Do you know the only other animal that gets leprosy? It's the armadillo. Now we get to the big guns. The 1350 CE, remember CE is the new AD, outbreak of the plague known as the Black Death. It was actually the second recorded outbreak of the plague, but it was a good one. It is believed to have begun in Asia and then moved westward with traveling caravans. It entered Europe through Sicily in 1347 CE as sufferers arrived in the port of Messina. From there, it spread rapidly through Europe and became so prevalent that there were dead bodies rotting on the ground, and that created a constant smell in the cities. They were really bringing out their dead, I'm not dead yet, to try and dispose of the bodies and stop the spread. The conditions got so bad that both England and France had to call a truce to their war because their soldiers simply couldn't keep fighting. Moreover, the plague changed the economic circumstances to the point that the British feudal system actually collapsed. Populations in Greenland were also ravaged, and the Vikings had to stop their battles with native populations and halt their exploration of North America. If left untreated, pneumonic, which simply means it infects the lungs, and septicemic, which means it infects the blood, plague, kill almost 100% of those infected. In London alone, it is estimated to have killed 70,000 residents, and globally it killed around 10 million people. That pales in comparison, however, to the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange begins in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, he didn't just bring sailors to the New World, he also brought disease, and subsequent voyages between the Old and New Worlds brought waves of new diseases to the Americas. The populations in the Americas were different than those in the Old World. They were less dense, and they didn't have the same types of domesticated animals as those seen in the Old World. In the New World, the Americas, there were domesticated llamas and alpacas, and smaller domesticates like dogs and guinea pigs, but those were only found in certain parts of the New World, mainly South America. There were no sheep, cattle, horses, or pigs, and these are significant reservoirs of disease. These types of domesticates and the nature of the contact between humans and these animals facilitated the spread of zoonotic diseases. Those are diseases that make the jump from an animal to a human. That means that there was more exposure to more kinds of infectious diseases in the Old World, and exposure generates immunity. But the Native American populations had not been exposed to many of the deadly diseases that already ravaged European populations, like smallpox, measles, and certain strains of influenza. The impact of these diseases was so great on the native populations in the Americas that it is estimated as much as 90% of the populations in North and South America died from infectious disease. When Columbus landed on the island of Hispaniola, the population of the Taino people was approximately 60,000, but by 1548, just 56 years later, the population was less than 500. This scenario repeated itself throughout the Americas. And the thing about infectious disease is that it has what is called a bow wave effect. That means the disease can actually precede the carriers. Much like a bow wave on a boat is pushed ahead of the boat, the disease can be passed from one person to another before the original carrier even arrives in an area. Such was what researchers believe caused the death of Huayna Capac, the last emperor of the Inca Empire. He died before the Spanish actually arrived in that area of South America in 1532, and his death plunged his empire into civil war as his sons, Huascar and Atahualpa, fought for control of the empire. They had just finished the war where Atahualpa was the victor when the first 200 Spanish arrived in Cajamarca in the highlands of modern-day Peru. The Inca knew the Spanish were coming, and they weren't afraid, but they were exhausted by war. Atahualpa was awaiting the arrival of his brother Huascar as part of his formal surrender. But before that could happen, the Spanish used a bit of rude trickery to capture Atahualpa. They held a dinner where for the Inca emperor, and when he talked about his religious beliefs, the Spanish priest in the group declared he was blasphemous, and he was captured. That caused him to kill his brother so he wouldn't know about the capture, and that caused the Spanish to kill Atahualpa, and things just went downhill from there. Thus, it was really the disease that caused the death of Huayna Capac that led to the downfall of the Inca Empire at the hands of the Spanish. They also brought more disease to the area. You have to think about it from their point of view. They knew what domesticated animals were. They had llamas and alpaca. So it wasn't the horses that frightened the Native Americans. They knew what weapons were. They themselves, the Inca, were conquerors. So it wasn't the arms that scared them. But when your enemy is telling you that their God is better than your God, and all of your people are dying from strange diseases you've never seen before, well, you might just believe them and surrender. The diseases themselves often killed so many warriors that the natives had to stop fighting. Such was the case with the Aztecs in 1520 and the fall of Tenochtitlan. They were not only so sick they were unable to resist the Spanish, they weren't even able to produce enough crops to feed their populations. In fact, research in 2019 argues that uh, the disease actually really caused fields to lie fallow, and that altered the Earth's climate as the vegetation that grew on previously tilled lands drew CO2 from the atmosphere and caused a cooling event. Something we've already seen is bad. Of course, one of the major players here was smallpox, but there were other diseases too. In fact, many believe that the very first epidemic to strike the Americas was some sort of influenza virus. And there's also evidence for a hemorrhagic fever disease. What made matters worse was that one disease struck after the next. This was particularly true after the Europeans began bringing their domesticated sheep and cattle to the Americas. It was just a steady stream of infectious diseases, and they killed as many as 56 million Native Americans in the 16th and 17th centuries. Okay, now it's time to move on to the Great Plague of London in 1665 CE. This was another outbreak of bubonic plague, and it led to the death of some 20% of London's population. People mistakenly believed that dogs and cats were responsible, and so they slaughtered hundreds of thousands of them. That actually caused more of a problem since cats hunt rats and rats carry plague. Just when the deaths from the plague were dying down, another destructive event, the Great Fire of London, occurred. Boy, sometimes you just can't catch a break. Now it's time for a new disease. Let's look at the 1817 cholera pandemic. It was the first of 7 cholera pandemics that would occur over the next 150 years. This disease infects your small intestines, and it is passed in its most lethal form via contaminated water. Here's an interesting fact about pathogens of any kind. Like people, they manipulate you into doing what they want. It's easier to describe this using the infamous guinea worm as an example, and then we'll revisit cholera. The guinea worm is believed to be what was actually depicted as wrapping itself around the winged staff of Hermes in the commonly known symbol of medicine seen here. It's actually called the caduceus. It's believed that the early versions of this symbol depicted the guinea worm because ancient treatments for this parasite involved grabbing a hold of a piece of the worm that is protruding from your leg and wrapping it around a stick to slowly pull it out, as you see here. The process of pulling it out could sometimes take days. That's the stuff of nightmares. Anyway, the guinea worm infects you when you get into water where its eggs have been laid. How do its eggs get laid there, you ask? No, you're going to love this. After a person gets infected with the eggs, the female guinea worm gets preggers and migrates to your legs where she wants to lay her eggs. When she arrives in your legs, she releases an acid that, of course, burns. And so you run and jump into water to cool the burning sensation. The joke's on you because that's exactly what she wanted you to do. Once you're in the water, she lays her eggs and the cycle begins anew. That's called host manipulation. You're the host of a very grim tea party, and the parasite or the pathogen is manipulating you to do something that will facilitate its spread to other hosts. This also happens with diseases, and in fact, a disease's lethality, that is, how deadly it is determined by how it spreads. Take the common cold. To spread, it needs you to be out around other people, coughing and sneezing without covering your mouth or nose, so it can spread. So it doesn't want you to be so sick that you're holed up at home because it can't spread that way. Malaria, on the other hand, spreads via mosquitoes. If you're feeling pretty good, you'll swat that mosquito dead, and the malaria organism won't be able to spread. So malaria needs you to be so sick that you won't swat the mosquito away. Thus, people sick with malaria get very sick, and it is a much more lethal disease. That brings us back to cholera. Cholera comes in two flavors, and one is more lethal than the other. The really deadly form of cholera makes you so sick with such rabid diarrhea and vomiting that it's coming out of both ends, baby. Now, this deadlier version occurs mostly in areas where there is not access to clean drinking water. Because you're literally unable to stop purging your bowels, you often soil your bedding, or maybe even squat down and poop right in the water. If you soil your bedding, someone taking care of you is going to wash it. Either way, the organism gets into the water where it can now spread. When people in areas where cholera is endemic are given access to clean drinking water, however, now that tactic doesn't work. Instead, you need to be less ill so that the organism can spread through human to human contact. Thus, in those areas with access to clean drinking water, the cholera causing pathogen has mutated to a less deadly form. That's host manipulation. I feel so manipulated. Well, this first cholera pandemic began in Russia, where it killed 1 million people. From there, it was passed to British soldiers, who thoughtlessly took it to India, Spain, Africa, Indonesia, China, Japan, Italy, Germany, and America. Millions more died. Next up is the third plague pandemic in 1885. That's persistence for you. This one started in China and moved to India and Hong Kong. It killed some 15 million people. It was used as an excuse by the Indian government to initiate repressive policies that would spark a revolt against the British imperialists. This pandemic actually remained active until 1960, when the number of cases finally dropped below a few hundred. Next up, the 1875 Fiji measles pandemic. When Fiji surrendered to the British Empire, a royal party visited Australia as part of a gift from Queen Victoria. But it was the gift that kept on giving. The party arrived during an outbreak of measles and then took the disease back to the island of Fiji, where it was spread by more tribal heads who met the party upon their return from Australia. The disease causes fever and a nasty rash, and it spread quickly and killed so many people that their corpses littered the island and were scavenged by animals. Entire villages were killed and subsequently burned down, sometimes with not dead yet sick people inside the fires. In total, some 40,000 people died, which amounted to approximately one-third of Fiji's population. That brings us to the flu. In 1889, there was an outbreak of the Russian flu. It was the first recorded significant flu pandemic, and it started in Siberia and Kazakhstan. It then traveled to Moscow, and from there it entered Finland and Poland, and then the rest of Europe. By 1890, it had reached North America and Africa, and by the end of that year, it had killed over 360,000 people. But of course, that paled in comparison to the Spanish flu of 1918. The Spanish flu was an avian-borne flu, and it killed 50 million people around the world. It was first observed in Europe, the United States, and parts of Asia, but it spread quickly. It was the outbreak in Madrid that resulted in it being called the Spanish flu. At that time, there weren't any effective drugs or vaccines. By October of 1918, hundreds of thousands of Americans had died, so many that there weren't enough places to store the bodies. Almost everyone alive at that time knew someone who had died from the flu. My own grandmother lost her mother and sister to the pandemic. Many researchers believe that the conditions of World War I helped spread the disease, and it's also believed that the peace treaty was influenced by the pandemic. Of course, as with today's COVID-19 pandemic, people were wearing masks, but even then there was resistance to the protocols put in place to prevent the spread of the disease. It finally eased by the summer of 1919, as most people who had been infected had either died or developed immunity. There was yet another major flu outbreak in 1957. This was called the Asian flu because it started in Hong Kong before spreading to China and then the U.S. It also spread to England, where it killed at least 14,000 people over a 6-month period of time. A second wave in 1958 is estimated to have killed approximately 1.1 million people globally. The U.S. had a total of 116,000 deaths. As with COVID, it was the advent of a vaccine that contained this flu pandemic. Now that brings us to 1981 and the HIV/AIDS pandemic. This is a sneaky one with respect to host manipulation because it effectively destroys a person's immune system. If you don't have an immune system, you can't fight the disease. People infected with the HIV virus often suffer fever, headache, enlarged lymph nodes, and as the infection spreads through the body, it destroys your T cells. These are immune system cells that can help you fight viruses. With your ability to fight off viral invaders effectively sidelined, any infection can kill you. Many people died of pneumonia as a result of HIV infection. They were initially misdiagnosed because no one understood what was really causing the problem. On top of that, as with many pandemics, there were moral judgments made against infected people. The disease AIDS or autoimmune deficiency syndrome was first observed in gay communities in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It actually was a zoonotic disease that spread from chimpanzees to humans in the 1920s. It then moved to Haiti in the 1960s and then New York and San Francisco in the 1970s. Because it was initially seen in the gay community, many people claimed it was a judgment from God. Again, this is some mean God they got there. Anyway, of course, it can infect anyone, gay, straight, or otherwise, and because it disables your immune system, it has been difficult to find effective treatments. Some 35 million people have died worldwide since the discovery of this disease. There is still no cure, although treatments are much more effective nowadays. The next major pandemic we'll talk about is the 2003 outbreak of SARS. SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, and as you probably know by now, it is caused by a coronavirus similar to COVID-19. It is believed to have spread from bats to cats and then to humans in China. From there, it arrived in 26 other countries and infected 8,096 people, 774 of whom died. That's a 9.6 mortality rate, which is much higher than COVID-19. The disease is characterized by a dry cough, fever, and head and body aches. It is spread through respiratory droplets that are produced when you cough or sneeze. Luckily for us, quarantine efforts were very effective and the virus was quickly contained. It has not since reappeared, but as with COVID-19, China was criticized for initially suppressing information about the outbreak. The outbreak was seen by many health professionals as a wake-up call to make sure they have effective outbreak responses in place. The protocols developed as a result of this outbreak were very effective in containing other subsequent diseases, including H1N1, Ebola, and Zika. And now we get to our modern problem, COVID-19. I'm sure you all know by now that this nasty little bugger started in Wuhan. But the jury is still out on whether it spread naturally from bats or was cooked up in a lab. Geneticists who have studied the virus can't find the telltale signs that indicate any human interference in how it was made. But the virus isn't really acting like it should if it was passed naturally from animals to humans. First, it was immediately able to spread from human to human. Usually that takes some time as the virus adapts to the new environment that is your body. So that's suspicious. But the other thing is that the mutant variations are more lethal than the original virus. Remember the host manipulation? Well, this virus should want us to be a little sick, coughing and sneezing, but mostly up and about so we can spread it to others. However, it seems to be mutating to make us sicker, which really doesn't make sense given how it spread. It does, however, seem very well adapted to spreading easily in the human population. That's another red flag that many evolutionary biologists feel could indicate it was made in a lab. The jury is still out on that one, but now we know that some Wuhan lab workers were actually sick earlier in 2019 than China had admitted. And the Chinese government does have a history of suppressing information. So we'll have to wait and see what the final judgment on that is. To date, COVID-19 has spread to pretty much every country on Earth. It has infected more than 174 million people and killed more than 3.75 million people worldwide. Now, you might be wondering how archaeologists can detect evidence for a pandemic in the archaeological record, particularly in the absence of a written language. Well, there are some interesting indicators. First, let's talk about what happens when an epidemic or pandemic hits with regard to the mortality curve of a population. This is a normal mortality curve prior to the advent of antibiotics or vaccines, that is. You can see that the mortality rate is high in childhood and high after about age 40 or 50. That makes sense because if you survive childhood, you've developed a really good immune system and you enter the prime of life where you are not as likely to die from the normal diseases that might be present in your environment. When you get beyond a certain age, however, your immune system gets weaker and a lot of other things happen. I'm telling you, it's a downhill slide and it's not for the faint of heart. Anyway, so you're more susceptible to getting a disease and dying from it. The typical mortality rate for a population, then, is a U-shaped curve. But with a disease that no one has been exposed to before, like the Spanish flu, you get a mortality curve like this one. It's called a W-shaped curve because you see an abnormal rise in deaths in the prime of life. That's because it's a new disease, and even people with good immune systems are susceptible. So if you're seeing that kind of spike in mortality among prime of life victims, and there's no evidence of trauma that could indicate warfare, then you're suspicious you're dealing with an epidemic. Another thing that people do when there's a new disease killing everyone is they abandon their normal mortuary practices. They do so to bury the dead quickly in order to avoid more infection. For that reason, you often see mass graves. Let's take a look at a mass grave that I worked on in Peru. I think it represents a mass grave that is likely the result of a disease spreading among the inhabitants of this community. The site is called Yosumal, and it's located in the northern highlands of Peru. It's in an area that were inhabited by a culture we call the Chachapoya. At the site, there was a semicircular structure that had animal bones embedded in the walls and had been filled up with a lot of dirt. But under that fill, there were at least 11 bodies recovered. Also included in the fill were these molars from a horse. Now remember, horses didn't exist in the Americas prior to the arrival of the Spaniards. So this tells us that this feature at the site of Yosumal dates to the post-contact period. The Spanish had already arrived there. The bodies that were inside this feature were kind of just thrown in haphazardly. They weren't arranged in any kind of burial position. And there was very few grave goods included with them. There were a few things, but they weren't very nice, and they too seemed to be haphazardly thrown into the grave feature. Here's another view of that grave feature. And you can see they're just kind of a jumbled mess. Now the bodies, once they were recovered, didn't show any signs of any kind of trauma that might have been related to their death. Some individuals did have evidence of disease. For example, this here is what I think are the beginning stages of Caricica. This is what happens to your cranium when syphilis gets to an advanced stage. Syphilis existed in the Americas prior to the arrival of the Spanish, and on this individual, the lesions indicating syphilis were all, healing or in the process of healing. So it doesn't necessarily look like this caused the death of this person. Plus, not everyone that was interred in this mass grave actually showed evidence of syphilis. Here's another possible case of Caricica. There were actually only 2 individuals that seemed to have any evidence of this disease. Here you can see another symptom of syphilis. It's called saber shin. This is the lower leg, the tibia, which is in your shin bone, basically. And you can see the lower shin bone that you see there is normal, and the upper one is curved, kind of like a saber would be curved. That's a signature associated with syphilis. But not everyone in this grave feature had syphilis, and there were all age ranges and both sexes present in this grave feature. So there were males and females, and there was young children, and there was older people, and then there was one person in their prime of life. So there's a couple of things that are possible with a feature like this. Maybe everybody died from a catastrophe that happened, some kind of earthquake. But that wouldn't explain the lack of trauma on the body. If they had been crushed by falling debris or fallen from a tall height, you would expect to see trauma on their bones. And nobody had any trauma that wasn't healed. Another possible explanation would be that they died in some kind of a battle. With battles, you do sometimes see mass graves, but once again, there's no trauma on these bones. Perhaps they were sacrificed. Possibly. And they could have even been sacrificed in some way that wouldn't put trauma on the bones, like, say, poisoning. But if they were poisoned, that's a major departure from the normal way that people were sacrificed in this region of the world. So that doesn't quite make sense. Really, the most parsimonious explanation is that they died from some kind of disease and that they were left, that the site was abandoned because of the disease. These people's bodies were left out. There's evidence they were left out before being buried. And then when people thought it was safe, they returned to the site and buried these victims in a very haphazard way in a common grave and then went about their lives. That's really the best explanation. And that's typically what you see with epidemics. So that's going to do it for today's video. It was a long one, but chock full of good information. If you enjoyed this video, please lean into the like button as if you're going to kiss it and then headbutt it. Then laugh maniacally as you click the subscribe button if you haven't already done so. And don't forget to tickle the notifications bell so you'll know the next time I upload a video. If you're interested to learn more about analyzing skeletons from different contexts, I've also included links to my books in the Archaeology and the Dead series, and I've included a link to my UDEMY course on how to analyze the skeleton. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.